I'm Dan HoSang. I'm the department head in ethnic studies, and on behalf of our department, it's an extraordinary pleasure to welcome back to the University of Oregon Dr. Ibram Kendi, who is an assistant professor of African American history at the University of Florida. In February of this year, so about 9 months ago, Professor Kendi delivered a magnificent talk in this room, similarly filled, titled Know Thyself, The Power of Anti-Racist Students, which was based on his first book, the award-winning Black Campus Movement. That talk was filled with many provocative and deft insights, but I particularly appreciated the generosity toward our campus and community that the talk entailed and displayed. Before coming to Eugene, Professor Kendi took time to research and acquaint himself with the organizing on our campus, led by Black students, incorporated it into his talk to ensure that it would articulate to the conditions and crises facing our campus then. Since that talk in February, Professor Kendi has released a second book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. The book has received lavish praise. The Washington Post described it as engrossing and relentless. A week after the November election, the National Book Foundation awarded Stamped from the Beginning the National Book Award for Nonfiction. And I should briefly note here that our campus has the honor of hosting the last two winners of this award in a short period of time. So Professor Kendi today and Ta-Nehisi Coates, the 2015 winner, will be here in February. Before presenting the award to Stamped from the Beginning, the chair of the committee of 4 judges emphasized not only how impressive all of the books on the finalist list were, but it was as a list, she said, quote, that feels ever more timely and ever more urgent. And indeed, urgency, she explained, was one of the criteria the judges came to use to select the winner of the prize. Quote, not just urgency in the subject matter, but an urgency in which we want you to read these books on the most important issues of the day. And in many ways, that seems to be the highest honor we can imagine for a work of intellectual labor and creativity, such as the book, that there is an urgency with which we want you to read it. These ideas and insights are important for our moment, that they matter dearly. Finally, by brief way of background, I want to mention that Professor Kendi received his PhD in African American Studies from Temple University in 2010, and I share this for 2 reasons. First, to note what a remarkable accomplishment it is for a scholar to produce 2 award-winning books while on the tenure track in less than 6 years. And that's in addition to more than a dozen book chapters and articles, many, many op-eds in a broad range of publications. And second, just to briefly acknowledge that the Temple Graduate Program in African American Studies in many ways represents the best of a critical tradition of publicly committed scholarship, training people to produce ideas that matter. We're thrilled that twice in 1 year we have the honor of hosting Professor Kendi, and please join me in welcoming now.
Well, I'd like to, of course, thank Professor HoSang for this opportunity to come back and to speak to you about Stamped from the Beginning. And it's truly an honor to be here. I actually really enjoyed my time here earlier this year, and I really felt the energy from the students, from the faculty, energy that would lead to some very progressive change on this campus. And I'm delighted to even hear that many of those changes have sort of begun to come about. And I know that people are probably fighting for more of them. So I am here to talk about Stamped from the Beginning. And sorry for those of you in the back if you couldn't hear me, I would like to provide you with some of the overarching findings of this text. And so I studied nearly 600 years of racist ideas. Okay, so what did I figure out? But then I also want to talk a little bit about how I went from writing a book on black student activism to writing an intellectual history of racist ideas, which, for us scholars, we usually sort of research in similar areas. And so it certainly is an intellectual jump. But I think if you see the way I sort of got from one project to the next, I think you'll be able to sort of understand it. And so I first want to start talking about that I wanted this history of racist ideas to not merely be an intellectual history, meaning this idea was, came about in 1685, and then this idea came about in 1786. I wanted to show the ways in which racist ideas had impacted American history, and I wanted to show the way in which American history had impacted racist ideas. But even more particularly, I wanted to provide a history of race in America. And early on in my research, I realized that this popular idea that America has experienced a steady march of racial progress is an incomplete way of understanding American history. And I say that because it's particularly pertinent for our current moment. And so Barack Obama, as being elected the first black president, to a large extent represents, embodies racial progress and its history. And it became a central point of many of his speeches about race, that in many ways he was saying, I am embodying this march of sort of racial progress, and we came so far, but we still have a long way to go. Anybody ever heard that? So, and of course, we've talked and heard a lot about racial progress over the last 8 years. Some have even made the case that not only has the nation progressed, we're now living in a post-racial society where racism is no more. Because apparently if one person can be elected to one house, then that means that the rest of us black folk can do everything, and if we're not, it's certainly our fault. But what I also wanted to say is that the reason why this history of racial progress has been incomplete is because I recognized very early on in the research that America has experienced a simultaneous progression of racism. And so we've had racial progress and this steady march of racial progress over the course of American history, but we've had this simultaneous progression of racism. And if Obama embodies racial progress, then Donald Trump embodies the progression of racism. And so that's why his election, for me, wasn't that surprising. Because it makes sense. That's the type of history where we've had. The progression of racism has consistently followed racial progress. And here is why. That when black people, or even other groups, but my research focuses on black people, have broken through barriers, those who instituted those barriers, do you think they just, oh man, the barriers are broken, so let's just go on home? No. Those barriers were benefiting them in some particular type of way. And so they then made efforts to institute new barriers to exclude black people. That is the progression of racism. The breaking through of the barriers is racial progress. The creation of new barriers is the progression of racism. And so American history or America's racial history, especially as it relates to black people, is literally that simple. And so I chronicle sort of both. And the way racist ideas play out in that history is throughout, because of the progression of racism, black people have continuously been barred from taking advantage of opportunities. And they have constantly been blamed for racial disparities and inequities. So that is the fundamental function of racist ideas, blaming black people and their supposed inferiorities for racial inequalities. All right, so I want to sort of stop there, and then I'm going to sort of go back to talking about how I got from this book on the black student activism to this history of racist ideas. And then I'm going to sort of move forward from that last idea that I just left off on. Would that be okay? Yeah. Oftentimes, as a narrator, we have to do that. So you're marching along in the narrative, and then you have to bring some context, and then you march forward in the narrative. I had to do that a lot in Stanford from the beginning. So I actually thought my second book was going to be a history on the origin of black studies. And so I had all of this archival research from universities across the country. And I wanted to write an intellectual history on the birth of black studies. I wanted to show the debates that black students and their allies were having with faculty, with administrators, even sometimes with politicians like Ronald Reagan, over black studies, to show that black students largely provided the intellectual rationale for this new academic discipline. And I wanted to show the capabilities of students to have an intellectual debate, not only with other students, but with faculty, not only with faculty, but some of the most powerful people in their universities and states, and oftentimes win those intellectual debates. And so that's what I sort of was thinking about working on, and I hopefully still will, but somebody may steal my idea. And so then I was like, okay, I don't want to just sort of show what these students were fighting for in the nature of more black studies courses or departments and ultimately ethnic studies. I wanted to show what they were intellectually fighting against. And so these students demanded a new academic discipline because they considered all of the existing disciplines in the humanities and social sciences to be racist, which is why they were like, we need something completely new, which they called black studies. So I decided I was going to write my first chapter on the history of scientific racism up until the mid-1960s, to give readers an understanding of how these students were making the case in 1966 and 67 and 68 that the academy was pervasively racist. And so, as any, what we do as historians and scholars, what do? You dive into the secondary literature, right? You dive into the books that have already been written on this topic, on the history of scientific racism. And so I, started reading, and the more I read, the more I began to sort of see this common theme. And that was that many historians were making the case that scientific racism became a marginal enterprise in the 1940s. So basically, the history of scientific racism largely ended in the 1940s. And so then you had these students, right, in the mid-60s, like, the academy is racist, and that racism is everywhere, and you had the historian saying, no, well, scientific racism had ended in the 1940s. Sometimes they said the early 1950s, but certainly it had ended by the mid-1960s in civil rights. By the time of Black Power, of course, it was no more, right? And so clearly I had this intellectual conundrum. Who is wrong? Who is right? Because they can't both be right, right? And so I realized that this distinction was based on how both groups were defining a racist idea. And so historically, scholars have defined racist ideas or even scientific racism, but racist ideas more broadly, in the way that a Columbia anthropologist by the name of Ruth Benedict defined racism in 1940 in her famous book, Race, Science, and Society. And this was actually the first major definition of racism. Of course, people use the term race, but really she is the one who pushed the term racism into the national vocabulary, specifically with this book. And so as we know, those who create and popularize the terms get to what? Define them. And so she ended up defining racism as an unproven assumption of the biological and perpetual superiority of one human group over another, which at the time was essentially eugenics. And those who were involved in the eugenics movement, who were making the case that the racial groups and even the ethnic groups and a number of different groups were genetically distinct, biologically distinct. Black people were genetically and biologically distinct and inferior. So she ended up defining that as racism, the eugenics, those segregationists who were supporting eugenics, that they were the real racists. While in the mid-1960s, in the late 1960s, the students were understanding a racist idea in a different way. They were challenging those scholars who believed that the racial groups were biologically equal, but believed that African American culture was pathological, that the black family was pathological, that black neighborhoods are more dangerous, that black people are lazy. All of these ideas about black cultural or behavioral inferiority were pervading the academy in the mid-1960s. Now, these scholars didn't say that black people were biologically distinct. They were saying that these inferiorities were the result of African American or even African culture, or even black people's history of oppression in segregation or poverty. And so these students called that racist too. And so I'm not afraid to say, and I'm not ashamed, I should say, to say that what led me to this book was how black students, I began to realize that black students went about redefining racism as they pushed for black and ethnic studies. And they redefined as racist what I call in the book assimilationist ideas. Notions that the racial groups are biologically equal, but that, let's say, black people, and this book is about anti-black racist ideas, are in some ways culturally or behaviorally inferior. And so, again, Ruth Benedict defined racism as an unproven assumption of the biological and perpetual superiority of one human group over another. Well, according to students, those who believed in the assumption of the cultural or behavioral and temporary superiority of one human group over another was also a racist idea. So I ended up defining a racist idea as any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. So in other words, people who have anti-racist ideas believe that the racial groups are equal. Not were created equal, but are equal right now at this moment in all of their differences, that the racial groups are equal. And that's not to say that black people or people of African descent act the exact same way that other groups of people do. That's not to say that there are not people of African descent who commit crimes, who are lazy, who are not that bright. That is to say that there are white people who commit crimes, who are not that bright, who are lazy. And no one has ever proven that one racial group has a monopoly or even has more people who exhibit positive traits than another racial group. People have used theories, they've put forth misleading statistics, but in my research of nearly 600 years of racist ideas, have yet to come across a single one that actually demonstrates that black people are in any way inferior. So that's what sort of led me to write this history. I realized that assimilationist ideas had largely been left out of the history of racist ideas. And in fact, those who I would classify as assimilationists had long understood themselves as anti-racist. And they had long been written into the history of race as anti-racist, as progressive reformers who were ushering America towards a more anti-racist society. And of course, I show that that hasn't necessarily been the case. I should also state that the reason why I wrote a history of racist ideas as opposed to a history of racist is because human beings and the human mind is extremely complex. So I came across numerous people in American history who have uttered or expressed both racist and anti-racist ideas, even sometimes in the same speech or in the same book or in the same sentence. and so it's extremely complex, right? And one of the things I should say is that not only have I found that people have expressed both racist and anti-racist ideas, I've also realized and came to grips with and narrated the fact that even black people had expressed and oftentimes consumed racist ideas about black people. That black people had expressed notions that there was something inferior about black people as a group. And I too have defined that as a racist idea. And so the book chronicles an interracial cast of characters producing and consuming racist ideas about black people. Now, I'm sure that many activists in this room would say black people can't be racist because black people don't have power. Anybody heard that idea? You're like, I heard that idea, and that's what I was going to ask you about. Well, one of the things that we should know is that to say that black people have no power is to say that black people are slaves. Because only slaves don't have power. But we should understand that there are multiple degrees of power. That black people do have some level of power. Now, do they have as much power as white people, let's say? Absolutely not. But to say that not a single black person in this country historically have had the power to discriminate against another black person, I'm not going to hire that black person because black people are lazy. To think that not a single black person in history has had that capability is to not really be honest. And so I chronicle many different figures in American history who have expressed ideas that there's something wrong and inferior about black people. And one of the reasons why I made it a point to chronicle and talk about the racist ideas that black people had produced and consumed is because I also noticed that many of these racist ideas were produced for black consumption, to make black people believe that they are inferior. Now, why would you do that? If you're a slave owner and you don't want your enslaved blacks to run away, don't you think it's smart for them to think that they should be slaves because of the color of their skin? Right? If you are a major business owner and through your enterprises you've kept black people in your area in poverty, don't you want them to think that they should be poor because they're black? Then they won't resist you and your policies. Right? And so what racist ideas does or have historically done for all people, but even black people, has been to prevent those people from resisting racist policies. Because in the most simplest sense, when you have a racial disparity, when you have a racial inequity, there are only two explanations for that racial inequity. There's only two explanations as to why 40% of the incarcerated population in this country is black, even though black people represent 13% of the national population. Either black people are more criminal-like, racist idea, or discrimination, racist policies. So any racial disparity, those are the only two explanations. And so let's say if you believe that black people are more criminal-like, that black people commit more crimes, then when you look out at the disparity, it's going to what? Seem normal to you. It's going to make sense to you, and you certainly are not going to resist it. And therefore, those who benefit from those policies that create that inequality will then be allowed to continue to benefit from it. And I say that to say that one of the major findings of this text is that our conception that the origins of racist ideas are ignorance and hate. In other words, the reason why people produce and have produced racist ideas about black people historically has been because they're ignorant and hateful. And it is these people with these racist ideas who are the people who have instituted racist policies like slavery, or even today mass incarceration, that we've been taught that line of thinking, that ignorance and hate leads to racist ideas. And then racist ideas lead to racist policies. And so that's why those of us who are interested in eliminating racist policies, we try to persuade away racist ideas. And one of the reasons why we educate those people who have racist ideas is because we think that they're ignorant, right? And so your strategy is going to be based on your construction of the problem. And so that's been our construction of the problem, that ignorance and hate leads to racist ideas, which leads to racist policies. And I found over and over again that that's quite ahistorical, to use a term that historians love to use. That's ahistorical. What has happened historically is people have instituted racist policies out of economic and political and cultural self-interest. And then those people or their propagandists and defenders have produced racist ideas to justify the results or effects of those policies, which are racial disparities. And then the circulation of those racist ideas is then what led to us becoming so ignorant and hateful. So really the sort of line of thinking about race in America historically has actually been the inverse of what we've been taught. And so actually self-interest has been driving the history of racism in America. Racist policies have been driving the emergence of racist ideas in America. Racist ideas have been driving the emergence of ignorance and hate, not the other way around. And so that then gives us a sense of how we can challenge racism in America. It gives us a sense as to why education and persuasion have failed. Now, I should say this construction is based on my distinguishing between what I call the producers of racist ideas and the consumers of racist ideas. So this book is not about the people who read the books. This book is not about the people who watched the movies. This book is not about the people who listened to the political speeches. This book is not about those individuals who watched and read that article or that column. This book is about the people who produced films, the people who wrote books, the people who have major speaking platforms, these major individuals who have the capacity to make you and I believe something, to make millions of people believe something as ridiculous that a racial group is inferior. And these are the people I chronicled. And so I studied, why were they producing these ideas? Why did John C. Calhoun in 1837 stand up before the US Senate and declare that slavery is a positive good? Why did he do that? Why did John McWhorter, after the election of Obama, declare that we are now living in a post-racial society? Why did he do that? Why do even people now, when Black Lives Matter emerged, why did people start saying, you know what, there's not a war on black lives, there's a war on cops, even though the number of fatalities among cops was declining? Why was this happening? And over again, I realized that these people were not ignorant. We know that they're not ignorant today. These people sit in think tanks and they think all day. It's their job to not be ignorant and thereby create these ideas that manipulate you and I into thinking that certain groups are inferior. And so historically, there's been many unorganized think tanks seeking to maintain racist policies. And that's been the sort of function of racist ideas historically. So again, I realized that racist policies was driving racist ideas, and racist ideas were driving ignorance and hate. And so what that then meant is we cannot educate away the racist ideas of the powerful who are producing them. Because they're not producing them out of ignorance. They're producing them out of a need to produce propaganda. Just like any other public relations arm of any company, they're going to produce notions that make their product that is harmful seem good for us, all the while knowing that that product is harmful. So then, okay, then how do we do this? How do we challenge racism in America? How do we create an anti-racist society? Well, the way to eliminate racist ideas is to eliminate racist policies. If we focus on eliminating racist policies, if we focus on eliminating racial disparities, which are the effects of racist policies, then racist ideas will come down too. But so long as there are racist policies, so long as there are racial disparities, there will be racist ideas continuously produced to justify them. And there's nothing we can do to stop that production. But we can stop the production and institution and defense of racist policies. And so I'm looking at my time. It usually tells me to shut up at a certain point. I'm almost there. And so I just want to sort of say that, so then how do you challenge racist policies, right? It seems very simple. Somebody has racist ideas, you educate them, right? It's a lot more difficult when you're thinking about eliminating racist policies. Well, so how do you go about doing that? Well, historically, racist policies have been changed or eliminated as a result of two things. Either people made it, usually protesters, made it within the self-interest of those in power to eliminate those racist policies. And so then powerful people were able to eliminate those racist policies out of pure self-interest. Abraham Lincoln ended slavery not because he had been convinced that black people should be free. Abraham Lincoln said, and I quote, "If I could end slavery, or I could save the Union and free all the slaves, I would do it. Just like if I could save the Union and free no slaves, I would do it." That's about 90% of that quote, right? So for him, ending slavery and issuing the Emancipation had nothing to do with this humanitarian sort of principle that we sort of bestowed upon him, right? He was all about saving the Union. He had a clear political self-interest. And why did the President of the United States want to save the Union? I'm sure everybody could sort of figure that out. And certainly his passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, but even more importantly, his arming of 200,000 black people was decisive in the Union being saved. Even the Civil Rights Movement, we're taught this narrative that because of the demonstrations and the marches in the South, that Congress and white America more broadly was sort of persuaded to end Jim Crow segregation. That's the narrative we're taught. Well, actually, it's a lot more complex than that. Those demonstrations, and specifically the horrific images that were circulating around the world, were harming American foreign policy during the Cold War. And so American power recognized that it was no longer in their self-interest to turn a blind eye to Jim Crow segregation. There was no way that they can establish business and political relationships in decolonizing Africa and Asia and Latin America and still with Jim Crow segregation. And that was clear-eyed and recognized first by the Truman administration all the way up to the Johnson administration. And so those protests, those demonstrations were key in demonstrating to the world that there was a problem, which then put America on trial in the court of public opinion in these countries. And of course, America had to respond. But it wasn't that people were sort of persuaded that these things were wrong. People already knew what was happening. I mean, people are smart. Come on. I mean, they know what was happening in the South. And so it became in the self-interest of powerful people to eliminate and change these policies. But another thing that's happened, and this is what I would advocate, because if we spend our time trying to protest racist power, what racist power will do is they'll eliminate racist policies as a result of protest pressure. But then what happens when protest pressure dies down? What do you think they'll do? Reinstitute those very same policies, right? So it's more of a short-term solution, and it's really a never-ending solution of trying to basically get racist power to sort of change their policies. You know, the long-term solution is to get in positions of power. And so that's why in the book, talking about that in order for us to create an anti-racist America of equal opportunity, where racial disparities do not exist, where we appreciate difference, cultural difference, aesthetic difference, we have to have principled anti-racists in power, who then are going to institute and defend anti-racist policies. And then those policies are held accountable by the people, because anti-racist ideas of human equality is in our common sense, which means that when we see racial inequities, when we see poverty for a specific group, we see a problem, we don't see normality. That's what anti-racist common sense is. And so it's in the common sense of the people to hold those policies, to hold those leaders accountable. That's the way we can create an anti-racist America, and that's the anti-racist America that I believe we can create. Because throughout American history, I not only chronicled those who were instituting racist policies, and more importantly, their defenders ideologically who were instituting and producing racist ideas to defend those policies, but I also chronicled anti-racist ideologues, people continuously challenging those ideas that there was something wrong or inferior about black people. And so it is those people who've continuously resisted racism who give me the hope, who give me the faith and belief that we can create an anti-racist America that will actually be beneficial for everyone. And because it is actually in the intelligent self-interest of nearly every group of people in this country to challenge racism. Because there's no way sexism is going to be eliminated in this country unless racism is eliminated. There's no way we can create income inequality in this country unless racism is eliminated. There's no way we can create a nation that's not homophobic unless racism is eliminated. There's no way we can eliminate ethnocentrism or even ageism unless racism is eliminated. All of these bigotries have historically played on each other. And not only that, the same people who produced these ideas about black people typically produced ideas about Irish, about women, about homosexuals. Like they were all service, full service bigots. I mean, they wasn't really just about race. And so I'm hoping that people will recognize it is in their intelligent self-interest to challenge racism, to create an anti-racist America where we have all different forms of equality. Because only people who truly need to be altruistic in order to be anti-racist are a very, very small group of super, super rich. And what I mean by super rich, I'm not talking about a couple 100,000. I'm talking about the top 1/10 of 1%, as Bernie Sanders would like to say. Super rich, Anglo-Saxon, white, Protestant, heterosexual males. That's it. Those are the only people. The rest of us need to merely do the intelligent things for ourselves. Thank you. So I think we have plenty of time for questions and comments. Yes, and I'll come here.
Hey,
Yes.
thank you so much for the talk. That was really great. I have one question about Trump's election. Around this, but so this self-interest. I'm wondering what the self-interest that's animating the racist ideas of Trumpism and the Trump campaign looks like. 'Cause it seems to me that the big business interests, the ones that we're often concerned with, are mostly on board with that kind of neoliberal multiculturalism that is different, but it's kind of neo-fascist racist ideas of Bannon and Trump. And so I'm wondering what the self-interest there is animating that. Was it just simply elected, or is there something else going on in the chat?
So I think in terms of Angela Davis, who is the last major character in the book, so the book is sort of organized around 5 sections, and each section has a major character. Angela Davis is the last major character. She once spoke about diversity that doesn't make a difference. There's been other terms like multicultural whiteness. And so there certainly is a corporate drive to diversify. But in many cases, this corporate drive to diversify is not about sort of diversifying perspectives. It's not about diversifying from a cultural standpoint. It's just a recognition that, you know what, I want to sell my products to the Chicana community. I want to sell my products to the black community. So I probably need to bring in somebody who understands a little bit about that community. And so then I can basically sell more products to them. But the idea of empowering those groups economically or even politically is certainly not the case. But one of the things I want to say about the self-interest of Trump voters, if you believe that the reason why income inequality has grown over the last 40 years and that you are struggling to get ahead in your job is because of affirmative action, is because of so-called illegal immigration, is because of these types of things, it's because of Muslims. If you believe that, then where are you going to put your angst and anger? On those groups. Because you see it in your self-interest, right, to challenge the people who are, quote, holding you back. So it makes complete sense that people would do that because they've been fed those ideas that's actually what's harming them. And then you have a politician who comes along and says, yeah, I'm going to go after those people who have been holding you back and who've been keeping America from being great. Then it's going to make, oh yeah, that's exactly the person that I want to vote for. Because you see it as being in your self-interest. But, you know, you've been fooled. Yes?
You spoke about how taking down racist policies would also take away racist ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But where does implicit bias fall in this? Like, maybe things were taught at a young age or is somewhat subconscious to some extent. Where does that fit in?
So that's a great question, and I've toured and spoken in many different places across the country, and this is the first time everyone has ever asked me about implicit bias. And I've been waiting for somebody to ask me about that. And I really like those scholars who are writing about and who are talking about implicit bias. I think these are a lot of well-meaning scholars, and these are well-meaning people. However, y'all knew that was going to butt coming right. I don't use the term implicit bias or microaggressions, or a series of other terms that have emerged specifically in the last 8 years to describe what I would consider to be racist ideas or racist acts or policies. And the reason I don't is for very clear reason. The reason I don't is because I think, and please argue with me on this is more of the progressive arm of the post-racial moment. And so we want to sort of move away from calling a dog a dog. And instead we want to create new terms, partly because we don't want to use the R word. And so I think that the more we use the R word, the better. And the more we identify a dog as a dog, the better. And again, that's not to say that there are not distinctions. In other words, you know, if your parents from birth have been talking about, let's say, black people in a particular way, then, you know, that certainly is going to, you know, that's going to seep into your consciousness in ways in which you're not even going to recognize. And then you're going to replicate those things and without even sort of recognizing where it came from. But all of those ideas that you are re-expressing, that your parents stated to you, or even society stated to you, are racist ideas. This isn't implicit. And so, and it's, I'll stop there. Yes.
Hi, I have a question. So earlier you mentioned that, the long-term solution is to be in positions of power, but then you also mentioned that, people of color could also hold racist ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So like how can we put people of power who are in our best interest? Because I feel like a lot of times we're let down by people who are in these positions. Like an example, like Obama, a lot of people feel let down because he hasn't come through with a lot of the things he has said. So like how do we address that in terms of like really looking for our self-interest when we kind of are fooled?
So I'm happy you used the terminology of being fooled, because one of the ways in which people who wanted to maintain racist policies, one of the ways in which they ended up doing that, specifically during and after the 1960s, in which people were demanding for black people to be in positions of power, is they put black people in positions of power who held the same racist ideas as the white people they replaced and were willing to execute the same racist policies as the white people they replaced. And so then it caused activists to have a conundrum in terms of what they were going to do. Like, how do we challenge this black person who said that black people are lazy, or saying all these things, or who are excluding black people, or even a Clarence Thomas who's saying, yeah, we are living in a post-racial society, so that's why we don't need this Voting Rights Act anymore, right? How do we respond to that? Well, I would argue to call them, again, we're calling dog a dog, right? And I should also state that when I stated that we needed people who were anti-racist to be in a position of power, I specifically said people who were anti-racist. I didn't say black people, for a very specific reason, right? Because if it was up to me, I had a choice between a black person who was racist or a white person who was anti-racist in a position of power over black people. I mean, come on, what do you think I would choose, right? And so that to me, so there's been a lot of debate about the role of identity politics, right, in our sort of activism. And that is the only aspect of identity politics that I have a problem with. To me, it's not enough to put a black person in a position of power. That black person has to also have anti-racist ideas, be willing to execute an anti-racist plan. And if they're not, then we should not be fighting for them and challenging for them. I mean, what's the point, right? They're going to replicate the same things as the people they replaced. And then we're going to be let down. And then we're going to wonder why.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Yes?
So it sounds like racism is what everyone should be focusing on, and I'm just wondering, how do you sort of get all of these different activist communities to come together and address racism when there's often this like oppression Olympics that can happen within activist communities? How do you, I guess, appeal to other minorities and other disenfranchised groups that racism is what we need to tackle?
So I would not say that racism is what we all need to tackle. And so I do think not only do we live in a racist society, we live in a homophobic, a sexist, we live in there are many different bigotries. And I do push back against those who claim that racism is worse than, let's say, some of these other bigotries. To me, they're all on the same level and we should understand them in an intersectional sense. But I would say that if we want to challenge racial inequity, we have to have a racial solution. And I would push back against those who say, oh no, this is really a problem of class. I don't know of anything else in which we create, so we have a problem that's a clear racial problem, and then we understand it, we think about other categories when we're talking about solutions. It doesn't make any sense to me, right? And I don't understand how we think that if we create a socialist nation, let's say, that racism won't exist anymore. I mean, one of the things we witnessed for those who have followed Castro's death is a lot of discussion about the way that racism continued in socialist Cuba, right? And so we should know, even those who are socialists should have a racial solution. Just like their socialism, they feel is the class solution to the class problem, right? And we can understand it as such. You know what? I want to talk about gender. I need to have a gender solution. I want to talk about class. I need to have a class solution. I want to talk about sexuality. I need to have a solution of sexuality. Like, why can't it be that simple? Why do we have to believe that if we solve the problem of sexism, that'll solve all problems? If we solve the problem of racism, that'll solve all problems. That's just not true. Yes?
I have a question just about, do you think that by segregating all of this different bigotry, that we actually hinder ourselves against a majority class of bigots? Does that make sense? So we divide ourselves, so it's easier to fight against smaller groups versus a large group.
So I would say that you have a scenario in which, in terms of, well, first of all, we should understand bigots as activists, right? I know we don't usually understand bigots or racists or even other forms of bigotry as activists, but what are activists if they're not trying to create change? Now, they want to create a different type of change, right? But they're truly going about trying to create change. So you do have people who are bigots who are focused on limiting racial or opportunities for black people, let's say. And you have bigots who are focused on challenging and eliminating Roe v. Wade, let's say. You have people who are actually bigots who are focused in each of these areas. And so to me, there needs to be a critical mass of people in each of those areas, not only challenging those people, but advancing the cause of equity in that specific environment. But then all of those individuals need to recognize the commonalities of it all and be willing at times to create a united front to challenge bigotry in general. And I think to a certain extent that has begun to happen as a result of Trump's election, because people are recognizing that this dude is not only, is he sexist, is he, I mean, he runs the gamut, right? And so we need to come together to fight him, or I should say the people he represents. Yes?
In your opinion, what is the role of education in this sphere, and how can we still use education to our benefit without acting like these problems are purely out of ignorance?
Sure. So I think that, the light just came on. I think there's a light in my mind. I don't know. But, so I think that education still serves a purpose. And the purpose that it serves is, first of all, each of us as individuals, we need to self-educate, right? I entered into this book not realizing that I held racist ideas. And I ended this book recognizing and challenging my own racist ideas. And truly coming to realize that the only thing that's wrong with black people is that we think something is wrong with black people. Nothing else. There's nothing wrong with black people other than we think something is wrong with us. So I had to come to grips with that. And even for whites, I mentioned this earlier also, that for white people to recognize that the only thing that is extraordinary about white people is that, you want to take a guess what I'm going to say? They think something is extraordinary about white people. That's it. That's the only thing that's extraordinary. And so for people to come to grips with the fact of human equality, literally, people have, from a racial sense, spent 6 centuries trying to prove that the racial groups, that there's a racial hierarchy. And they have yet to come across, they have yet to basically make that case. Just like feminist scholars in here will tell you they spent many millenniums trying to prove, right, that there's a gender hierarchy, and they have failed, right? And so at some point, when people, the best minds, right, in nation after nation, for generation after generation, has been trying to prove something, and they have failed. At some point, we have to realize, you know what? They failed because it's impossible. because the racial groups are equal. And so for us to come to grips with that. And what that means is that when we see inequality, we are looking at discrimination. We are not looking at what's wrong with the people who are on the lower end of that inequality. But then when we have to mobilize activists, we have to mobilize anti-racist activists. And so how do you do that? By educating them. But these are the consumers of racist ideas who you could educate. You could educate them away from their racist ideas. And so you mobilize them through education and allow that to form a power block that gives you the ability to fight racist power. Yes, oh, one more question, okay. Yes?
First, I found this really stimulating and interesting. I wanted to ask you about your ideas about the sort of the development and the spread of racist ideas and then how to eliminate them. And I guess it comes out to sort of a two-part question, if you can bear with. So as I understand, you were saying that the people who propagated, you're saying it's like propagandizing these ideas, were not themselves ignorant or hateful, but rather they were self-interested, and they came up with an idea that would help them control labor or whatever it was, have an economic advantage. But I guess my question on that is, your examples were people who were already living in a very racist society, so surely we can assume that these people were in fact racist and self-interested both, and that there isn't necessarily one or the other. So I guess I kind of wanted you to, a little more on that. And then the second part was, towards the end of your talk, you talked about how we can eliminate racism by getting principled policymakers. And what intrigued me was that you had originally said, well, the people who kind of gave us racism were not principled themselves, they were self-interested. Mm-hmm. And maybe that means that the people to eliminate racism don't need to be principled either. They just need to be self-interested. Mm-hmm. And we need to make it their self-interest.
Yes.
But that principles are not what we need, either at the beginning or the end of the racist story. So anyhow.
So thank you for saying that, because I think if somebody would have asked me sort of what makes somebody principled, would be their self-interest, right? And they recognize the ways in which an anti-racist society is beneficial for them. And so that's actually what I was, I wasn't thinking principled from an altruistic standpoint, principled from a self-interested standpoint. In terms of your first question, what we should understand is that yes, these people were being born in a society that already was circulating racist ideas. However, new ideas had to constantly be created to justify new racist policies, or to justify new racial inequities, or to justify a new historical moment. And so, to give an example, during the enslavement era, black people were said to be extremely hardy and strong people. And that's why they were physically superior, and their physical superiority demonstrated their closeness with animals and their distance from white people who were intellectually superior and further away from animals. And so that was one of the major constructions that justified their enslavement. And then during the Civil War, you had propagandists who were making the case that black people should not be armed, claiming that they were physically weak. They were not as strong, as the white male soldiers. So why would you sort of arm these sort of physically inept people? And then when there was a fear of these so-called physically inept people who were free overrunning America, you had the creation of notions of, you had people who borrowed notions from England that the fittest are also the most superior, and the most superior are white. And so ultimately what I'm saying is that it was the case that ideas were already existing, specifically the longer we sort of marched in American history. But there were always new circumstances that created the need for new racist ideas. And so that's how I then got to, so then why were they creating these new ideas? So the question was always about not the old one, but the new one. And when I sort of focused my intention there, it became clear that they were not producing these new ideas out of ignorance. I actually started to question whether they even believed the ideas themselves. Like, really, John C. Calhoun, you really believe slavery is a positive good? Like, you own hundreds of people, you watch them get ripped and raped, and you really believe it's a positive good? Thomas Jefferson, who wrote about in his notes in the state of Virginia that black people were basically in elementary school intellectually. But then when he would have his skilled captives run away, he and other slave owners would write in advertisements for them how smart they were. Right? And so those are the types of things, and I can go on and on with examples like that. It was like, do they even really believe what they're saying? And of course, propagandists oftentimes don't believe the things that they say, but they recognize their power. And so again, the focus was on the new ideas. The new ideas like we're in a post-racial society. Shelby Steele and John McWhorter and others, they know just as much as anyone all of the studies that have documented racial discrimination. They know those studies, but they ignored those studies. And why did they ignore those studies? Why did they produce this idea? Yes. Oh. Any other? Oh, yes.
So, in your opinion, after looking at this history of racism, have we made progress?
So yes, but racism has also progressed. And the post-racial idea, I would argue, is probably the most sophisticated racist idea ever created. And the reason why it's so sophisticated is because what it does to people who believe it, like once you believe that we are living in a society in which discrimination does not exist, it then compels you, it sort of turns you in the direction of creating your own racist ideas to then justify all of the racial inequities that still persist in our society. Because again, going back to, there's only two causes of racial disparities. Either there's something wrong with black people, or there's discrimination. And if you have been led to believe that discrimination is no more, then it then causes you can do it on your own. You'll end up on your own creating ideas to then justify inequality, and that's what people have done. And we've had the proliferation of all of these ideas over the last 8 years. And people don't even recognize the ways in which they have been sort of led to do that. They've been ushered down that road of the development of racist ideas. And it's quite tragic.
Do you want to take one more or you're...
Oh, it's up to y'all. I can take one more. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you believe that a country that believes in capitalism ends up influencing or promoting racist ideas because of the way the society is structured?
So it's an interesting question. He asked if, are you basically asking if racism emerged out of capitalism? So, of course, that is the theory among Marxist historians. And it's a very old and popular theory. And a few Marxist historians in the room are going to get upset at my response.
I just said not all Marxist historians.
Oh, not all Marxist historians. Okay, yes, not all Marxist historians. Okay, so don't be going, are you a Marxist? No. So one of the findings of my text is I tried to pinpoint when exactly racist ideas emerged. And what historians have told us is that capitalism as an institution emerged during what's called the long 15th century, roughly 1440 to 1640. Is that roughly sort of accurate? And so then what they say is that, well, racism didn't emerge until long after that, right? Some would say 1600s, most say the 1800s. And so clearly racism emerged out of capitalism. But I actually pinpoint the origin of racism in 1453. A Portuguese writer by the name of Gomes Zurara became the biographer of somebody named Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry the Navigator just so happened to pioneer the African slave trade. In other words, the Portuguese were the first nation to begin exclusively slave trading in African people. Right? Other European nations and even Muslim nations had been slave trading in African people and Slavs and Muslims and other groups of people. But it was the Portuguese that began exclusively slave trading African people, and Prince Henry in particular, who pioneered that enterprise. And so then Gomez Zurara was ordered by his king, who was also the uncle of Prince Henry, to write a biography of Prince Henry's travels into Guinea, as it was called at the time. And so I'm sure you would imagine he was also the royal chronicler. In other words, he worked for the state. He was also a member of the Military Order of Christ, which was basically this quasi-military / Christian organization in Portugal, somewhat similar to the Knights Templar. And who was the head of the Military Order of Christ? Prince Henry. So Gomez Zurara writes this glowing biography of Prince Henry. And how does he justify his pioneering of the African slave trade? What did he say as to why they were doing this? He described the people who he enslaved as beasts, as people who were being brought to civilization and to Christ, and that slavery was actually good for them. And so he created, the Portuguese ended up slave trading a number of different African ethnic groups, created a scenario in which they all became one, and they all became inferior. And so this was the first major book written in the modern era by a European scholar on Africa. And so I argue that really was the origin of racist ideas. And then the future slave traders cited that book to justify why they were slave trading in African people. And so what that means is that racism emerged during the long 15th century, at the same time that capitalism emerged. And from the beginning, they were sort of playing off each other.
We want to leave some time. There's some books in the back, a small number of books that are for sale, and if you have a credit card, we can also take orders so Professor Kendi can sign them. And we have Professor Kendi for about 20 or 30 more minutes. Please join me in thanking Ibram Kendi.